difficulties, so I'm sorry for the slightly late start. And we'll just jump right in now. So thank you for joining today's webinar about the final rule for the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. My name is Jennifer Dempsey, and I'm the Director of American Farmland Trust Farmland Information Center, and I'll be helping to facilitate today's call. Before we get started, I just want to run through a few housekeeping items. First, we'll be recording today's call, and you should have heard this notification as you logged on to the call. And that's because we'll be posting the webinar on the Farmland Information Center website. Second, we've actually muted all attendees, and that's just to avoid problems with feedback. We have a large group. There will be a few chances during the presentation to ask questions. There are about 3 breaks, and there'll be time at the end. We'd like you to actually use the question feature to do this. You should see a control panel in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. It may be minimized right now. If you open up that box, you'll see that there's a place where you can just type in your questions. They'll be sent to us, the organizers. We'll review them, and then we'll read aloud the questions to the panelists at the appropriate time in the presentation. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can during the allotted time. We'll also be writing up responses to all the questions we receive. So even if we don't get to it during the call, we'll make sure your question gets answered. And finally, you can use that same question feature in case you're having any technical issues. We have a few people online who can help you if you get disconnected, if you're having trouble with audio. And now I'd like to introduce today's panelists. We'll be hearing from NRCS staff with the National Easement Division. So first, we'll be hearing from Jeremy Stone, Acting Easement Support Services Branch Chief. This is a change, as most of you recognize. Also on the line, we have Jessica Groves, National Easement Specialist, and Jerome Faulkner, Acting National Agricultural Land Easement Manager. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jeremy Stone.
Thank you very much, Jen. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thanks, Jeremy.
Okay, great. All right, I'm going to put the slides up on my screen. Can you see the slides now? Oh, show my screen. That would help, huh? Okay.
There you go.
All right, excellent. Okay, everyone, thank you very much for dialing in and joining us on this webinar. As Jen mentioned, on the line with along with me are Jessica Groves. She's the primary architect behind the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program's final rule. So she's going to be on the line with us after we get to the presentation to probably answer the more detailed questions, the more technical questions about the rationale. Jerome Faulkner is also on the line with us. He is our Agricultural Land Easements Program Manager, while I am detailed to another project that Jen listed there that doesn't deal directly with our agricultural land easements, but deals with acquisition services that we are standing up to support our states. So in the interim, I will be giving the presentation, but Jerome and Jessica are on the line to answer the tougher questions. Okay, and finally, before I get going, our division director at NRCS for the Easements Programs Division, Kim Burns, wanted to be here today, but she could not. She wanted me to pass along the message to all of you to thank you very much for your past participation in both the Farm and Ranch Lands Protection Program and the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. Thank you for the passion everyone showed and interest in the program by commenting on it to the extent they did. It was the most commented on program at NRCS in the last Farm Bill, even when combining all the other comments received under all the other programs. You all had more to say than anybody else, so thank you very much for that. That's how we get a better program. And she also wanted me to remind you that even though we have a final rule, we're always working to improve our processes and deliver better customer service and improve the program. Our aim is to have consistent and efficient program, have an consistent and efficient program so that you all are able to get the best conservation on the ground possible. Okay, and with that, we'll get into it. As you all know, since you're dialed into this, the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, or ACEP as we call it, final rule has been published. It is at 7 CFR, that's the Code of Federal Regulation, 1468. If you do look that up on the web right now, on the Government Printing Office's website, the actual text at 7 CFR 1468 has not been updated yet. So you'll want to go to the Federal Register to see those changes. This rule was published effective on October 18th, 2016, and the best way to get to it is to go to the NRCS Farm Bill page, follow that link there on the screen. You'll find a summary of some of the key changes from FRPP to ACEP, as well as a link to the Federal Register so that you can see the final rule, read the preamble, and see the changes to the body of the final rule. So as I mentioned, everyone had a lot to say about ACEP. There were 102 individual commenters who submitted a total of 1,055 comments. By far, the Agricultural Lands Easement Program was the most popular. Between the grasslands component and general ALE, it was over 83% of the comments received. And as you're looking at the body of the final rule, the majority of it will be the preamble discussion, and the changes to the body of the rule are in subpart B for the AL component. The changes to the body of the rule are not that extensive. They are fairly minimal. However, the preamble itself, that's the discussion that precedes the changes, is very extensive. It includes a summary of the comments received, NRCS's responses to the comments received, the rationale for how we address those comments, whether we made a change or not. We do respond to each of the comments, and we explain why we made a change or why we didn't make a change, and so that you have a better understanding, and future program managers, both the national, state level, have a better understanding of why things are the way they are in that final rule. And then we clarify and explain our approach. And I want to make sure that everyone understands the preamble is a great source of information about ACEP. If at any point you're wondering, well, why does the rule, or what is policy, or why is that state program manager telling me something? I would recommend the first place you go is the preamble. Take a look through there, see if the subject is addressed, because NRCS is not trying to hide the ball about why we're doing anything. The preamble will explain to the best that we can now why we did certain things. The reason why we're here today is to continue that discussion and answer any questions that you might have after reviewing that preamble about why we may have done something. So the highlights from the preamble. As I said, there are comments and discussions on all of the topics received, but in particular, there are comments and discussions on individual minimum deed terms. That's the document that should be attached to each of your cooperative agreements. It's posted on our website, and it's one of the hot topics in the Agricultural Lands Easement Program, and it's something I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. We did discuss that at length in the preamble. We discussed the changes to the minimum deed terms. However, they were actually made back in April of 2016. The version of the minimum deed terms that you all should have attached to your 2016 cooperative agreements is actually in response to the comments received to the final rule. So our goal is not to make significant changes to the minimum deed terms in 2017. Personally, my goal is not to make any changes. I would love for us to be able to close out the Farm Bill and cover the next few years with one consistent document so that we all know what we're working with, and then provide flexibility through the template approval process. So if you haven't, take a look at that 429.16 version of the minimum deed terms, especially after reviewing the preamble, so you can see what changes were made to them and why. Other preamble highlights. There's a lengthy discussion and clarification on the difference between the regulatory deed requirements and the minimum deed terms. Those are two related but different topics, and we'll discuss that in more detail in these slides. We also discussed the new process to allow states to submit additional state-specific minimum deed terms to address local concerns. That was a comment we received, a request we received from participants to allow the state conservationists to work with partners in the state, conservation organizations, their state technical committee, to address specific resource concerns that they're discovering in their state and they're not addressed through the minimum deed terms. One of the common examples we have is habitat mitigation or habitat efforts that is not typically a topic in agricultural land easements, but is something that the conservation community in a state feels needs to be addressed on a broad regional or statewide way. So that's something we clarified the state conservationists have the ability to do. If it's something you and your state conservationists have already worked out, great. What we've done in the preamble is to clarify that process, how you go about doing that. And we've also explained in detail the process for developing an entity-specific deed template. A number of organizations have already taken advantage of that opportunity. And for those of you who are used to the Farm and Ranch Lands Protection Program model, it will seem familiar because it is the route to creating a more flexible, mission-specific ALE deed document. We did try to strike a balance in ALE that wasn't there in FRPP, or at least to find a better balance between consistency, efficiency, and predictability. So we offer 3 options, which I'm sure you've heard me talk about in the past, which are the attach, where you attach our minimum deed terms, where you incorporate our minimum deed terms into the body of your deed, or the template option, where you adopt and adapt the minimum deed terms to better fit within a deed template that works for your organization. And we laid out that process and the flexibilities built into the template process in that preamble. In response to the ACEP Final Rule being published, we are updating our manual. The anticipated publication date is March 2017. However, we do want folks to be continuing to implement the program, so we have issued implementation guidance and provided updated exhibits for the states to use. We'll go into some of the specific exhibits that we've provided in this presentation. FY17 guidance will be updated and clarified as needed before the manual comes out. Okay, so Jen, that's our first break for questions, just covering the generally what's in the preamble and the rule process.
And I haven't seen any questions be submitted, so I think you can continue.
Okay, we'll do. So now we're going to get into the changes to the body of the rule itself. We're going to go through each of the major changes, and then at the end, once we've gone through all the changes, we'll have another opportunity for questions. So as I said, these aren't changes to, this is going to be the actual changes to the rule itself, not the discussions in the preamble. So one of the big changes we made, probably the most significant for a lot of you, is that we added definitions to these 3 topics in particular. We defined ALE agreement, at-risk species, future viability, and grasslands. In addition, we also revised the definition of grasslands of special environmental significance. By revise, what I mean there is that we did clarify within the definition that wet prairie is an acceptable form of a grassland of special environmental significance. From NRCS's perspective, we did intend to include wet prairie in the original definition of grassland of special environmental significance. So if you happen to have had an application that included that, that's fantastic. Hopefully it was funded. It certainly was a grassland of special environmental significance. However, we just wanted to make that more clear going forward. As to the definition of an ALE agreement is now the term used to refer to either an ALE cooperative agreement or the ALE grant agreement. We didn't change necessarily the definition of ALE agreement. What we did is clarify that that term applies to both the ALE cooperative agreement and ALE grant agreement, and throughout the rule it is used globally and if one or the other is specified, we do that by name. That was done for clarification purposes, not to change anything substantive that was in the interim final rule. That change will also be made to the manual itself. Okay, so we're going to go through 3 of the definitions that folks might have the most questions about. The first is grassland. Important to note there that we have clarified that grasslands include improved pastureland and rangeland, and land in which the vegetation is dominated by grasses, grass-like plants, shrubs, or forbs, including shrubland, land that contains forbs, pastureland, and rangeland. This definition was what was brought over from GRP, given the merger of FRPP and GRP into ACEP ALE. A lot of you, I'm sure, are aware by now that one of the major changes between ACEP and FRPP was the inclusion of the conservation priorities that were originally found in our Grasslands Reserve Program. That's had a series of effects throughout the body of the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. It has given ACEP ALE a broader mission, and with that comes the need to define exactly what we mean by some of these new terms, at least new to FRPP. So we've added the definition of grasslands there. In addition, since we do use the word at-risk species in our minimum deed terms document, we provided a definition of that so that there wasn't any confusion and people didn't provide it with an overly broad interpretation, which was what was happening in a couple cases. We were specifically asked to clarify that. And we did so by providing a definition that's consistent with that term as it's used in the other NRCS rules, such as EQIP in the Conservation Stewardship Program. And then finally, future viability. Obviously, that's a pretty important term for ACEP. It was a new term to the program from FRPP, and it was identified as one of the primary conservation purposes for the program, which is to preserve the future viability of agricultural land and grassland. So we have provided a definition that says future viability is the legal, physical, and financial conditions under which the land itself will remain capable and available for continued, sustained, productive agricultural or grassland uses while protecting related conservation values. That way, we're all clear as to what NRCS means throughout the programmatic documents by future viability. So those 3 definitions and the definitions in general are pretty important. Definitions are obviously foundational to how we discuss the program. So I wanted to make sure we paused after discussing those in case people had any questions.
Just wait a second in case anybody wants to type something in at this point. There haven't been any questions that have come in, but if we just wait a minute for me.
It does take a little longer to type a question than ask a question.
Yes. So someone has asked something. Hold on. It says, can you please list which federal and state laws apply for at-risk species?
I couldn't list all of those off the top of my head. Perhaps Jessica or Jerome could provide some examples.
Or is there a resource that you could direct people to, to consult?
That's something you speak to your state staff about. They're going to be better informed as to what state laws are going to be impacted by the definition of at-risk species, especially in their state.
Okay, well, that's our only question at this point.
Okay. I think Jerome or Jessica might be having difficulty unmuting their phones, but I would ask if you all get them unmuted, feel free to break in if you have a better answer to that question.
No, Jeremy, your answer to consult with their state staff is perfectly exactly what I was going to say. So.
And can you just go back the slide, back a slide? Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Someone was asking to go back. Same person.
And Jen, you did get a copy of these slides, so I assume we'll be able to provide a copy to the presenters so they don't have to furiously write them down as they're going along.
Yes, we'll post that with the recording of the webinar and also answers to any questions. And we'll email folks when it's all made available.
Great. Okay. So the next area of change, environmental markets. We clarified here basically that ACEP funds cannot be used in situations where landowners are under a court order to carry out the conservation practices already. So if they're required by a court or are otherwise responsible to implement the conservation practices, they would not be eligible for ACEP funds. What we're not saying here is that a landowner under ALE is to be excluded from future environmental markets. What we're saying here is at the time they're enrolled, if they are required to take certain actions, they won't be able to use ACEP funds for those actions. So I just wanted to be clear, and I think this issue probably comes up a little bit more in WRE than the agricultural land easements. There's not a lot of situations I can envision where someone is required by a court of law to place an agricultural land easement on their property. So we did, to continue the theme of addressing the new grasslands requirements, did add national ranking criteria, specifically one dealing with grasslands. For those of you who are familiar with our national ranking criteria for prime farmland or prime soils or statewide and unique soils, it will look very familiar because we've gone to the same source, the agricultural census, and pulled a similar question that deals with grasslands. So we've added that into the national criteria. We've also made minor changes to several of the other criteria at B1, 8, and 10, and we've broadened the multifunctional benefits section of the state ranking criteria. There we added things like carbon sequestration and climate change resiliency as factors states may want to consider when evaluating a project. State ranking criteria and national ranking criteria are slightly different. National ranking criteria must be used. How they are evaluated and how they are weighted is still up to the state office, but under the regulation, under the rule, states must consider the national ranking criteria when evaluating each project. For state ranking criteria, we provide those to the states as options. They could pull from any or all of the state ranking criteria to evaluate the projects during a specific ranking period. And they may choose different state ranking criteria at different times throughout the year, so long as they are published 30 days prior to the close of the ranking period. So you may see one state selecting certain ranking criteria from the state list and a neighboring state selecting slightly different state ranking criteria. That's completely fine so long as they are addressing the state ranking criteria identified. And our goal with state ranking criteria is to provide the states with the greatest flexibility to address, again, the conservation resources that they've identified and that their partners have identified as the priorities in that state. It's similar to the concept of the state conservationists and the partners being able to come up with specific minimum deed terms for their state. And in fact, those two items could very well be related. They may be looking to, for a given ranking period, protect specific resources, and the conservation community in that state may feel that it's appropriate then to ask for a specific deed restriction to go along with that conservation resource that was responsible for the ranking point. Updated ranking sheets reflecting these changes have been provided to the states in the FY17 guidance, and those are sample ranking sheets. The states are not required to use the published ranking sheets from national headquarters. They're provided as templates for them to begin customizing. They certainly can use, and in some cases where where they line up with the state priorities, they do use those sheets for their purposes. And those were made available to them within the last few weeks. So you should be seeing the states going through the process of updating their FY17 ranking and then publishing those. Just to look at the national ranking criteria specific to grasslands in a little more detail, it is asking whether or not there's been a decrease in the percentage of acreage of permanent grassland, pasture, and rangeland other than cropland and woodland pasture in the county in which the parcel is located, and that's specifically in the county, between the last two USDA censuses of agriculture. Other changes to the body of the rule. Compensation and funding for ALE. We added additional considerations for projects of special significance. And just as a reminder, a project of special significance is that category of land where the state conservationist can reduce the cash match requirement. So it's the project of special significance waiver, and it's a decision made by the state conservationist whether or not a project falls within one of the special significance categories. If it does, they can reduce the cash match requirement down to the specified threshold. For example, majority of states, there's a 50%. Well, in all states nationwide, the baseline requirement is that a participating entity provide 50% of the federal contribution amount in cash. So if we provide $100 to the purchase of an agricultural land easement, the partner must then provide $50 to the purchase of that agricultural land easement. If a state conservationist determines that a project falls into the area, one of these special significance, in most states, they'll be able to reduce that amount down to $25 or 25% of the NRCS contribution. And that goes to the cash contribution requirement. And obviously, whenever you reduce the cash contribution requirement, the landowner's donation of conservation value does increase. And we discussed that in the preamble, how that does make this a slightly tricky incentive, because it's something we have to balance in considering the utility of this incentive. This is something that we can discuss in greater detail if people have questions. But the two areas in particular where we broaden this category, because our goal is to allow states to identify those projects of special significance that are of most importance to their state, is projects that are part of a comprehensive plan to protect large blocks of agricultural land or facilitate transfer to new and beginning farmers. And that's a tricky category because we don't want to incentivize transfers to new and beginning farmers while at the same time decreasing their ability to buy into the project. So we don't want to take money out of the pockets of a new and beginning farmer from a conservation easement transaction while incentivizing the participation of a conservation easement on that project. So it's most likely going to be a situation where a organization is engaging in a buy, sell, protect scenario in addition to utilizing this particular incentive. Another area where we've added a project of special significance status is where a project comes into the ACEP ALE with an existing RMS plan or a higher level of conservation planning with practices being applied in accordance with NRCS standard specifications. So obviously one of the big changes between FRPP and ALE was the requirement for a whole farm agricultural land easement plan. That requirement is not for an RMS level plan. However, if a project comes in with an existing RMS level plan, that's a project that a lot of states would consider to be especially significant and is something we would certainly want to protect in perpetuity. Oh, my next slide button doesn't seem to be working there. Let me see if I can Okay, there we go. The next change is one of clarification. We received a lot of comments that clearly indicated there was some confusion about the difference between what we are now calling regulatory deed requirements and the minimum deed terms. If you look at the body of the ACEP rule, there are a list of 9 topics that must be addressed by all agricultural land easements, whether it's a project being done by a certified entity or a non-certified entity. The vast majority of participants in agricultural land easements at this time are non-certified entities. So in addition to addressing the regulatory deed requirements, they must address them in the ways identified in the minimum deed terms. And that's the document that most people are probably familiar with from a day-to-day implementation basis. And those are the specific deed clauses attached to the cooperative agreements, and that we ask you to be attached, incorporated, or used in a template ALE deed. So to be clear, or I'm going to try to be clear, and certainly an area we can discuss in greater detail, all entities, whether certified or non-certified, must address the 9 regulatory deed requirements identified in the rule. In addition, we ask for a greater specificity in meeting those 9 deed terms by non-certified entities, and that's the document attached to your cooperative agreement. There is a difference. One of the main benefits of being a certified entity is the ability to forego the use of the minimum deed terms, as a certified entity has proven through a history of participation in FRPP and ACEP ALE that they are able to meet the program requirements without additional requirements from NRCS, and they've been approved by the state conservationist and the regional conservationist, and therefore all they need to do is address the 9 topics identified in the regulatory deed requirements. With that in mind, there is one of the 9 that must be addressed in a specific way by all entities, whether certified or not certified, and that is the U.S. right of enforcement. It's a regulatory deed requirement to include a right of enforcement for NRCS. For both non-certified and certified entities, the U.S. right of enforcement clause is provided by NRCS and must be used in all deeds. This is the exception to the statement that certified entities can use their own deed terms to address the regulatory deed requirements. The U.S. right of enforcement clause was modified in FY 2016 in response to several of the comments that we received, in particular from state agencies. So take a look at that FY 2016 modification. In particular, it limited the United States' ability to recover funds in the event an easement is not enforced to the amount of federal funding. And that was a concern that we understood a lot of our partners had, so we made that change to the right of enforcement to limit that recovery, to provide certainty and transparency to organizations who were worried about that potential. It's a very unlikely potential. We very rarely, if ever, have seen that happen. In fact, I believe it's only occurred once that the United States has had to explicitly exercise the U.S. right of enforcement. But it's an understandable concern, and therefore we made a change to limit that cost recovery in the U.S. right of enforcement. But to give you some background on why it's very important for NRCS and USDA as a whole that this clause be included in the agricultural land easements deeds, and more so than any of the others. It's been an issue in the event that we've had to defend these easements, or partners, organizations such as the ones on this call have asked us to become involved in defenses of these conservation easements. Not necessarily situations where we've had to fully exercise our U.S. right of enforcement, but where there's been, for example, a condemnation case, whether it's for a pipeline crossing, a series of FRPPs, or for the condemnation for a telecommunications line, or for a road widening, and where a local partner or a state-level partner has asked for NRCS to become involved defending that easement. We've had situations where, upon review, the deeds themselves did not include what was at the time the Office of General USDA Office of General Counsel's recommended U.S. right of enforcement terminology. And when our Office of General Counsel consulted with the Department of Justice and the United States Attorney's Office, they declined to represent us in those proceedings because we had not used or had not required the use of the specific U.S. right of enforcement terms or terms that they found to be defensible or to provide them with a reasonable likelihood of prevailing in those cases. So it's very important for the defensibility of our easements and our ability to leverage the resources that I believe a lot of you are counting on us to bring to the table, that we include the U.S. right of enforcement as it's published. So I hope that provides some clarity. I understand that may not still be something that everybody is thrilled about, but hopefully you can at least understand where we're coming from with that requirement. Changes to the body of the rule, other clarifications. So we also identified that eligibility must be determined for the year of enrollment. That comes into play when we're dealing with substitutions. One of the things that we've been able to regain in the last year or so is our ability to do substitutions of parcels that have not actually been identified on the cooperative agreement in advance. That's something that was more common under FRPB around 2008, but as a result of some audit findings and our lack of documentation on eligibility resulting from substitutions, and just generally the financial status of those substitutions, we lost that flexibility as a result of audit, as a result of the requirements needed to satisfy audits. However, in the last few years, we have instituted what I'm sure a lot of you have heard about, which is our enhanced internal controls process, where we are doing a better job through internal processes of keeping track of our own transactions. And that's what our internal controls process does. Because we have instituted internal controls, we have regained that ability to provide you all with flexibility for substitutions. So if a parcel drops out and you haven't identified a substitution at the time you enrolled the original parcel with us, but you have one at the time of opening becomes available in the cooperative agreement, you can now go ahead and suggest that new parcel to your NRCS state office, and they can add it back into the cooperative agreement. That's a long way around to say the eligibility for that new parcel must be determined at the year of enrollment, or the year that you offered it to the NRCS. So if the original agreement was, say, a 2015 cooperative agreement, and at some point this year a parcel drops off, you'll be looking at the landowner eligibility as it exists in 2017, not looking back to 2015. Okay, also the final rule also more fully identifies the grasslands and grazing uses and related conservation values. Basically, we've done a better job of explaining the conservation purpose as it came over from GRP as a program purpose co-equal with protecting agricultural uses and future viability. It was a little, the statute provided us with some difficult terminology to incorporate, and we think we have found a better way to explain it in the final rule than we did in the interim rule. We also clarified that an AL plan must be signed by all parties. It's not something that can be unilaterally signed or amended by just one organization or one person. So it must be signed by the landowners, NRCS, and the entity, which makes sense, but we wanted to be clear about it. A couple of caveats before we take questions. These slides are non-exhaustive list of the changes. They are just a list of the highlights. Please do read the final rule and preamble if you haven't had a chance to do so, especially that preamble. It is a really valuable source of information. It will at least give you some idea of where we're coming from in some of the decisions that were made. There is a summary of changes document on our website. Please do also use that as a resource. And as we discussed when we were talking about those at-risk species, the state office will be able to provide you additional updates as updated manual exhibits implementation guidance is published. They are and will remain your best source of information on the program. Okay, Jen, I believe that's all my slides, and I think it's time to open it up for questions generally. for myself, Jerome, or Jessica.
Sure. So if you have come in, the first question going back is just a question about when the changes take effect. Do they take effect immediately for FY17?
Yes, they took effect for FY17 on October 18th. So we'll be operating under the final rule for this entire fiscal year.
The next question is a little more specific. So this is related to the environmental market rule. And the question is, what if the court order is temporary? And the entity saying our AL easement is perpetual, but the easement restrictions will outlast and provide permanent protection for the court order time period.
That is an interesting question, and I hate to punt on it, but I'm going to have to say it's something we'd have to look at on a case-by-case basis to see exactly what the court order is and what we're looking at. So I open it up to Jessica and Jerome if they want to dive into that one in more detail, but I think we'd have to look at the specific order, and the state office is going to have to make a land eligibility determination at the time of application.
Yeah, this is Jerome Faulkner. I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself last time when I chimed in, but yeah, as I'd have to agree, Jeremy. In those cases, we would probably need to look at the state what the court order says, the specifics of the court order, and get an evaluation from our Office of General Counsel on the specifics of the situation in that situation.
Okay, so the next one is, will NRCS allow substitutions for FY 2014 cooperative agreement projects, even if the parcel was not on the original attachment list?
So FY14 is the exception. FY14 is, to some extent, locked into amber. It was a hybrid year between FRPP and ALE. So we have a limited ability to change those agreements. We were operating under very specific authority for 270 days provided to us by the Farm Bill itself. So 2014 agreements exist as they were entered into at that time, and we really can't make any changes to them. But we welcome your substitutions on the FY15, your FY16, and the applications for all those parcels on FY 2017.
Okay, so there's another question. So this has to do with minimum deed terms. And do they need to be attached to the cooperative agreement, even if NRCS has approved a state-specific deed template that's being used instead?
If we have approved a template for that organization, because templates are approved on a cooperating entity by cooperating entity basis, they're not approved statewide. So if we've approved a template for use by that cooperating entity, then that would be attached to the cooperative agreement once it's approved, and that could be attached in the place of the minimum deed terms, or it could be attached in addition to the minimum deed terms. That's between the partner organization and the state NRCS office, exactly how they wanted to administer that. But at a minimum, it would need to be attached. It could take the place of them, though.
Okay. A next question is, can a substitute project be eligible and considered on more than one cooperative agreement?
A substitute parcel should only be listed on a single cooperative agreement at a time. So if you have it on a 15, you wouldn't also have that substitute parcel on a 16 agreement. But you also don't, as we said, you don't need to list substitute parcels on the agreements anymore. So not sure why someone would list one at this point.
Okay, and next question are, how do certified entities know that their easement deeds meet the regulatory deed requirements? will NRCS provide feedback?
What a lot of the entities who are seeking certification are doing is providing a ALE deed template for review in advance of seeking certification. So that process is occurring prior to certification. It's not required at all, but it's a great way for them to know that their eventual deed meets the program requirements once they are certified and aren't receiving the benefit of that NRCS ALE deed review process.
And Jeremy, just to add also, if they used a deed that had been approved before they were certified, if they didn't make any changes to that deed when it has already gone through the deed approval process, that would provide some assurances that it meets the requirements.
Yep, that is very true, because that's exactly the organizations that would be likely to be certified, is those who have participated in ALE or FRPP. In this case, in ALE, and successfully used a deed that's been used, successfully got an ALE deed through the process.
And there aren't
Sorry, this is Jessica Groves. There may be a few other points of clarification on this as well. First, as far as having an entity-specific deed template approved, certainly we explained this in the preamble, but just to reiterate, one of the things that we would very strongly encourage is that if an entity wants to pursue having an entity-specific deed template in place, that be done prior to entering into the cooperative agreement, or what you should anticipate is certainly a longer lead and review time. One of the things that has been hit on before, but maybe not in this discussion, is that those entity-specific deed templates are going to be the least expedient option up front because it's going to take the time that it takes to negotiate those agreements individually, which is why we recommend that you pursue those in advance of a cooperative agreement so that it is in place by the time that you have any parcels approved and actually enter into a cooperative agreement, so that it can be included as an attachment to that agreement. So from a timing standpoint, we would definitely encourage you to do that way earlier in the process, just because everybody needs to be aware of the fact that that is the lengthiest option on the front end. However, once those templates are in place, the idea is then that it would be as expedient as the standard minimum deed terms, because at that point you would be using a pre-approved set of terms that don't have to go through the level of individual review that's required when there's variability to all the individual deeds. So that's one point. And so then to carry forward with what both Jeremy and Jerome had indicated, for those entities that as a non-certified entity wind up with an entity-specific deed template, if they do later become certified, certainly that already approved deed template is something that they can use and thus have that level of certainty that those deed terms would be acceptable to NRCS. Similarly, if an entity wants to pursue certification but does not have an entity-specific deed template, the minimum deed terms certainly provide a very clear indication of what would be the kind of acceptable terms that NRCS would consider to satisfy the requirement to address the regulatory deed requirements. So I do think that in spite of the fact that for certified entities, NRCS will not be reviewing the individual deeds prior to closing, we have provided a few paths to clearly indicate what NRCS would be looking for in terms of terms that would satisfy the regulatory deed requirements. So those are just a few things you can look to.
And I would also add that a ALE deed template, once it's approved, you receive a letter from the Easement Programs Division Director that indicates and guarantees the approval of that ALE deed template for the remainder of the Farm Bill. So for as long as we're operating under this Farm Bill, that ALE deed template could be used, and it could be used on multiple cooperative agreements, not just the cooperative agreement or cooperative agreements you have in place at that time.
There's another question, and this is about the period to cure violations under 7 CFR 1468.28F. Is it 180 days or 60 days in the final rule?
I believe it is 180 days, but I would have to go back and check. Jessica perhaps may know off the top of her head.
I'll double check, but I believe one of the changes that we made was to increase that to 180 days.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right here, and it's 180 days.
Yep.
Okay, and there was a follow-up, again, about the deed, and the same person was asking what about variations to the approved deed, how to know that the deed still meets the requirements.
I guess I'll answer it as if I understand. I'll make an assumption that they're referring to an ALE deed template. For an ALE deed template,
entity, right?
Pardon me?
A little bit more just came in, so this is for certified entities.
So a certified entity would most likely, they would need to evaluate that using their in-house expertise and familiarity with the program requirements. That is presumed for a certified entity. So certified entities don't have the benefit of a second review of the deed by NRCS, as it's one of the administrative efficiencies captured by the certification process. So you should, as Jerome or Jessica mentioned, you could be using a prior approved deed or deed template, or attaching those minimum deed terms, or using those as a guidance tool.
And then there's a question just for clarification about some of the succession planning. So in the context of demonstrating commitment to long-term viability, what is acceptable in the range of options? And is that still being worked out?
I will go ahead and defer to Jerome, because not only is he the acting ALE program manager, he is our specialist in the ALE plans.
Yeah, so for succession plans, we have the final rule didn't provide any additional verbiage to what we have been saying in our ACEP AL manual related to succession plans. So we're looking at anything that provides evidence that there has been a discussion, or there are discussions about the future viability of the farm, such as anything from a formal succession plan, or even an informal plan by the landowner to look at what the property is, what the farming opportunities will be after they are no longer the landowner. So we're still, as we've said, I believe in some of our AL trainings, we've provided a lot of flexibility still on what is acceptable as showing that long-term farm viability.
And I think Jen might be a good time to plug the succession planning modules you all are putting together.
Okay, so
yeah, you don't have to, but
no, I would love a chance to plug this upcoming online tutorial. We're actually preparing it for our key audience that we have in mind are the NRCS program managers in the state offices, but it might also be useful to others. And And so the topic is farm succession planning and ACEP AL. It will be an online tutorial. As I mentioned, we're thinking of breaking into sort of 3 chunks where we'll talk about how succession planning fits in the context of the program. And when we're talking about the program, we're focusing in on ACEP AL. And then we'll talk in general terms about the process of farm succession planning. And we'll be trying to give the program managers and the NRCS state program managers signs to look for that landowners and or entities have taken steps. And then we'll be reviewing some of the most frequently used and most effective tools in the context of a farm succession plan. And we're also going to be spending a little bit of time just defining what a farm succession plan is, because when we had some conversations with the NRCS staff just in relation to implementation of the AL plans, that was a question. Just, you know, we're not sure what these are, and so it should be a very good tutorial. We're in the process of sort of finalizing content and getting it recorded, and it will be posted and available on the Farmland Information Center website. So in the meantime, we've had another question, and that is about the maximum time period for each review process. Appraisal reviews, deed review, internal controls, included on the NRCS website or in the guidance manual or elsewhere.
That's a good question. And so I would point folks to their cooperative agreement, because that's the document that controls our relationship with you all as partners, and that's where you should be looking for those sorts of cues. The cooperative agreement asks you to provide us with the documents that you just mentioned, the ALE deed, the draft deed, the baseline documentation report, the appraisal, and the agricultural land easement plan 90 days prior to your identified closing date. And NRCS will, if these are provided to us within 90 days prior to your closing date, then we will work them through those review processes so that they are ready to go by your closing date. But it's really important that they actually get to us in an approvable form 90 days prior to that closing date. So there are internal guidelines for our staff to meet that we expect them to satisfy under policy, and those are all designed to fit within those 90 days. For example, for those of you who are closing in on a 2015 or an extended 2014 cooperative agreement, you should be getting those documents to your NRCS state office no later than December 31st of this year for that March 31st closing date mentioned in that cooperative agreement.
There's actually a question coming in, so we'll just give it a minute. And I wanted to do a time check at this point because Jeremy, Jerome, and Jessica, we had talked about, you know, reserving the hour and a half, but we would see how the questions were going. So we'll see if anything else is rolling in, and if not, we may stop the webinar early. So one question I see is, how long does it take on average to get an AL plan completed?
That, go ahead, Jerome. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just, so that would be dependent on quite a few different things. The AL plan, in the cooperative agreement, there is 2 options for the AL plan. One is that the entity drafts the AL plan, or the entities can elect to have NRCS prepare the AL plan. And so, depending on which option is chosen, there would be 2. If the entity prefers the AL plan, then the AL plan then has to be reviewed by NRCS to make sure that it meets the requirements that we've detailed in the ACEP manual. Of course, if the NRCS prefers the AL plan, then of course we're going to prepare the AL plan, those requirements, and using our planning and procedures handbook and our field office tech guide.
Yeah, and so just to clarify, they were interested in the NRCS option. And so about how long is that taking?
Right now, we haven't. I haven't looked at how long. We haven't asked how long the AL plans in states are taking to prepare. I do know that we haven't had any situations where the AL plan has delayed any closings that I'm aware of. And so our goal, as Jeremy said, is to have everything ready in time for the proposed closing date, and the AL plan would be one of the documents that we would want to have two entities prepared and ready for review by the entity and the landowner prior to that 90-day closing.
And as Jerome mentioned, there's going to be an awful lot of variables that go into the AL plan. That's something that if an entity selects NRCS as the drafter of that plan, that's a conversation that NRCS is going to have with the landowner and the entity to figure out what their goals are for that property and do those site visits. So I would recommend, if you are concerned about about an NRCS drafted plan, you contact that state office and start working with them and make sure that they've reached out to the district conservationist or whoever is going to be drafting and creating the more technical portions of those plans as soon as possible. There is, from the close of the fiscal year of enrollment to the proposed closing date, 18 months to close those easements under the terms of the cooperative agreement. That should be more than enough time for an AL plan to be created. So if that's a document that's of concern to folks, since it is the new one to the list in agricultural land easements from FRPP, I would recommend early in the fall, so right around now, if you have, or I guess now we're into late fall, early winter, if you have signed up a project for 2016 funding, then I would reach out to your state office in the near future to find out what the plan is for developing that agricultural land easement plan, and make sure that all the parties who need to contribute to it are aware of it and are ready to participate in that process, because it really is going to be about having a conversation with that landowner and learning what their goals are for that property, so that our technical staff can create a document that meets the landowner's expectations.
Okay, and another one rolled in, which is, can an entity use the 2015 minimum deed terms attachment for a 2014 project?
That's a good question. I suppose we could look at that. I mean, I don't know if we would object to it, but they may be better served using the FY16 deed terms. They are probably going to be more appealing to both the land trust and the landowner. We have done more to refine and improve them and address a lot of concerns in the 16s. So hopefully the question asker will take a look at those 16 terms. Those are definitely something you can use for a 14 project. We would highly encourage you to do so. And I think you'll find them a better fit anyway.
Okay, then can you just provide a little bit of an update on the Easement Support Services branch? That might be of interest to folks.
Sure, I can do a brief summary. And if you give me a moment, I can even put up some slides really quickly, and I will try to go through them. If I can get my computer to respond. There we go. All right, there's our discrimination statement at the end of that presentation for everyone. But let me also just go here real quick and bring up an existing presentation. Okay, whoops. Shouldn't have said from the beginning. If you are slightly seasick, I'd look away from your screen. I'm about to scan through these slides. Okay. Jen, has the screen on your end caught up to the changes? Can you see an arrow on your screen?
Yes, and I see a slide that says Easement Support Services.
Okay. So Easement Support Services is a concept, it's a branch, it's a product that NRCS is standing up to provide additional resources to our state offices. It's going to participate and provide services to states for a very, very small portion of the agricultural land easement, wetland reserve easement, floodplain easement, healthy forest reserve easement programs, and help the states streamline and take advantage of the various efficiencies that can be gained from having a dedicated cadre of experts do a limited number of tasks that are not going to involve all the things the states are specialized in. The ESS is going to be looking at title, record search, survey, all the administrative processes, internal controls, financial paperwork that our staff have to fill out. It's going to be doing a lot of the things you most likely have heard your state points of contact be less than thrilled about having to do. Some of them do love title, record search, and surveys. There's no doubt about that. And we will still hopefully be benefiting from their expertise and skills in those situations. But the other work, the work that is not something that a natural resources specialist is normally asked to do in another federal land management agency, we're going to actually be entering the modern era of federal land management agencies and providing them with the support services they need to get those things done, so that you're not hearing from your state points of contact that they're having to deal with IC, DBSB, APSB, and all the other alphabet soup processes that they have had to deal with over the last few years. So things that ESS won't affect, as you can see on this diagram. It will not affect state outreach, sign up, resource priorities. The state will still be doing all the ranking, all the land eligibility, all the project selection, all the planning activities, whether it's agricultural land easement plans or wetland restoration plans or all the other types of documents. It will not affect on our other programs, the restoration, the compatible use, the management, or the monitoring enforcement. Those are all things that our state level staff are expert in and that they do for our wetlands programs, our forest programs, and our repealed grassland programs. Those are all things that they do, and frankly, they need more staff and resources to do, and by working through ESS for this small little sliver, they will be able to spend more time doing that. The reason why one of the reasons why we're doing this is because all the other federal agencies have been doing it for a long time. And this is just a graphical representation. This is not an actual survey of what other federal land management agencies are doing, but it gives you some idea of the scale that NRCS is looking at here. A lot of the other federal land management agencies do a smaller total number of easements every year. NRCS does over 600 easements a year with a very small cadre of realty specialists. That small little red sliver there at the top of the NRCS slide underneath our raindrop has been carrying a heavy load for a very long time, and they've been relying on a lot of other staff throughout the country to carry some of that burden. And it's probably the root cause of a lot of the issues that you all have had to deal with NRCS over the years, as far as consistency and efficiency and our ability to respond back to you on things like title and other issues. Whereas some of the other federal land management agencies have a much larger cadre of specialists working in these areas. So these resources are going to be made available to our state offices over the next several years. We're taking a very measured approach to this process. The commitment that our leadership has made is that as we stand up this support services branch, we will only be rolling it out and including states in the process as there is a team of specialists ready to take them on. We are not going to be standing something up on paper without providing it with the resources to provide the service, because that's just going to decrease the quality of service that team is able to provide, and that will only make the process worse, not better. So we will be standing it up over the next several years. It's not a fast process. We've piloted it in a few states recently. We learned an awful lot from that and made a lot of changes to improve that process to figure out exactly what would work best. And we've seen other divisions in our agency do make similar efforts, and that's why we're committed to only rolling it out in a measured and deliberate way when there are staffing resources available to do it. So states will be working with a transition team that will assess and evaluate their staffing capabilities, their projected need from existing easements and future planned easements, or potential applications they will receive, and they will be brought into the system based on that survey and staff resources as the teams and branch are ready to provide them with that service. It is a part of a larger easement implementation strategy that you most likely have already heard about. Enhanced internal controls, easement support services, and training are all part of our easement implementation strategy to provide a better service to our landowners and our land conservation partners. The enhanced internal controls has helped us successfully pass a clean audit for the first time in a number of years, and it has allowed us to regain a lot of the authorities and efficiencies that we used to have and flexibilities we used to have, and has put us in a very good place. So we're really proud of that, and a lot of the credit is due to not only enhanced internal controls, but a lot of our remediation and financial management staff. The other part of it you probably have already seen is the easement implementation strategy is our training. You probably heard from your state points of contact that they were out of touch for about a week this year. That's because they were at one of our trainings. Jessica Groves actually, in addition to being the architect behind the ACEP Final Rule, was the leader of that training effort. And she and Jerome actually spent an incredible amount of time traveling to regional sites and providing detailed training on our programs to our staff so they could provide you with the expertise. Jerome or Jessica, do you want to say anything about that, that training effort?
Sure, Jeremy. We had 6 training locations in fiscal year 16 that we went out to all across the nation, where we were training primarily state office staff, and each state was allowed to at least have two employees participate in that training, and on ACEP, on the ACEP program, the ALE and WRE, and we also, in that training, we had field scenarios that we had the staff participate in to kind of to go over some of the differences in our NRCS roles in the ALE as compared to WRE, and each training lasted a total of about 3.5 days. And we received some very good feedback, and it was a huge effort to really cover as much as we could cover in that time, and in some cases some of the first official type of training that easement programs has offered for the program. And so I was just going to add, Jeremy, and in fiscal year 17, we're continuing that training by offering it at 2 sites for fiscal year 17, and we have introduced that as part of our in our ag learning system, which is where our official trainings are located. So that the goal is to have that continue for the foreseeable future, as long as we're under this farm bill.
Exactly. That's all I was going to add to.
This is Jessica. The other thing I will mention is that we've had discussions of having sort of analog opportunities available for the entities. The trainings we've provided so far have been predominantly internal. So one of the other things that we've been working on is an AL 101 type presentation. It's a online module that would be not only available to internal staff, but as well as external partners. So that's still in development, but we do understand certainly the importance of being able to do things like this, and certainly Jeremy and Jerome have interacted with the partners, with all of you guys at various in various other venues. But we do want to make some of these training modules available so that you also have them available for your reference. So that will hopefully be one of the next things coming out now that we've been able to get through these on-site regional sessions, are some of the more standing, readily available online training items. So that'll be one of the next things hopefully coming.
Jessica, this is Jen, and I have a follow-up on the training, which is just, now that the state staff have been trained, will they be hosting workshops or trainings for the entities in their regions, or?
They may. We did make all of the materials available that we provided, in those courses. So like Jeremy said, the target audience was the state level folks. So we did intend for it to be a bit of a train the trainer type course so that they could take portions of that and either, train their own NRCS field level or area level staff on components. Certainly, they won't need the whole gamut. But likewise, yes, if states want to do, within state, either training or presentations or those kind of opportunities for partners, they could certainly adapt those materials to do that as well. I do know of a couple of states that have done it or that are working on things like that. We haven't mandated anything like that, but we've at least made the materials available.
So yeah, that's to answer that question, probably more than the questioner was expecting. That is Easement Support Services. It's part of our Easement Implementation Strategy, and it goes along with training. It is distinct from enhanced internal controls, but it will provide the states with the support they need to make enhanced internal controls truly an internal process and something that is less onerous for them. So, and I will say that's the first time I've ever been able to answer a question with a ready-made PowerPoint presentation. So thank you.
That almost seemed like we planned that, and we didn't.
We didn't know.
No, that was good. So we've had another question come in, which one person's asking where are these materials, the PowerPoint, the webinar today, so where it will be available. That will be posted on the Farmland Information Center website, which is www.farmlandinfo.org. So it'll be featured on the front page for a time. And then in addition, we had another question. Let's see. Well, this is a long one. So this is back to the final rule, and this relates to AL application. If an AL application is for a farm that has had some land that is in permanent pasture, the rule seems to suggest that this pasture would be considered grassland. Would this need to be delineated in the easement as grassland and the grassland minimum deed term language included in the easement, even if the purpose is not to protect this grassland specifically as a grassland resource?
Okay, that's a great question, and I will take a crack at it, and then I will turn it over to Jerome to fix all the things I misstate. So, yes, permanent pasture land, if it's in grassland use, as it's defined there, would need to be delineated because there will be one restriction in the minimum deed terms that addresses grassland uses. They do not need to include all of the other grassland language that's available in minimum deed terms unless they're applying for ALE as a grassland project. But there is one deed term that will address grassland uses that would not be delineated necessarily in the deed. Certainly they could. That would not be my recommendation. I think we would prefer that it be delineated in the agricultural land easement plan. And in fact, I believe the minimum deed term would indicate that because it's something that will change over time, and the agricultural land easement plan is by nature a living document that can be changed as the uses of the properties change, the resource concerns change, the desires of the landowner change. So they would go about identifying the grasslands in the property. They would identify if there are any protections for those grasslands and their related conservation values. They would also do that in the agricultural land easement plan because, again, it's a living document and things will change. So that's why it's associated with that term, is because this is not a grassland enrollment necessarily. It has a resource that's been identified as extremely important by the 2014 Farm Bill in ACEP. So we have to address it. And that's why you saw so many changes related to grasslands. Not so many, but why a lot of the changes that you see are related to grassland, because one of the big changes from FRPP to AOD was an emphasis on protecting grassland resources. Whether or not they're a grassland enrollment, the statute requires us to provide some basic protections for grassland grazing uses and their related conservation values. So we're doing that using the agricultural land easement plan as required by statute because it's a living document. So Jerome, anything to add, change, correct?
It sounds like you've heard that still before, Jeremy, and so you covered covered it quite well. Yeah, no, that's you're right on.
And Jeremy, this is Jessica. I mean, I don't know if I'm not understanding the question, then that's fine. But I think one of the simplest ways to think about it is that if the project is eligible because it's eligible under the grassland eligibility criteria, that is the point at which the grassland language in the minimum deed terms needs to be used. But if the land is eligible under any of the other criteria, the prime and unique soils, supports state or local policy, or the historical or archaeological, if it's eligible under any of those three, then to Jeremy's first point, the provisions related to the grassland itself, including permanent pasture, are predominantly addressed in the plan rather than the deed. But if it is eligible under that grassland provision, and that's how the entity has applied, is under that eligibility criteria, then that is what triggers those grassland provisions in the deed itself.
I agree with both those statements.
So there's a different question back to training. And there's a question from an entity about if it would be possible to include both the NRCS state office staff and then also entities in the same on-site regional trainings the next time you plan them.
This is Jessica. I'll go ahead and take that one. It is possible, yes. This first round that we did really covered all ACEP, so we spent quite a bit of time on WRE as well as ALE. So we have discussed doing basically sort of a pared down version, more focused on ALE for both groups. So we haven't gotten there yet because the first sort of order of business was to just get the first round of the internal trainings done. But yes, we have talked about that being another potential future need, that it would be for both the internal and the external audience, but we would need to, number one, pare down what we did. And I would also say we need to modify some of the materials just so that, I think we answer more questions maybe from both perspectives. And ideally, actually, I think we would probably want to have some input from some entity folks as we were developing it, because on the cadre this last time around, it was all NRCS. So yes, it's on the sort of wish list docket. We were just getting through the initial round first.
Hey, I think that, let me just see, I think somebody is trying to do a hand up. I don't know what that means. It looks like there's someone who's interested in writing a question, but they're using the hand up. But if you could type it in as a question, that would be. And we're actually at time, so if this could be the last question. No, maybe not. Okay. So Jeremy, Jessica, and Jerome, thank you so much for being panelists today and talking to us about the ACEP final rule. Again, we'll be posting these materials on the Farmland Information Center website. Can you switch over to this? So we're going to put up a slide just with the contact information. Can you see it there? So it's www.farmlandinfo.org, and we'll post the recording of the webinar. We'll post the answers to any of the questions we received. And if anyone wasn't able to get their question in, you can just contact me either directly or quickly type in something now, and we'll also add that and try to get that answered for you. So thank you, everyone.